All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Ryan Williams. I'm president of the Claremont Institute, and I want to thank you for joining us for this mini conference, Fighting Enemies Foreign and Domestic, the Legacy of Angelo Codevilla. The purpose of this is really to remember the man's life and work and contribution to American politics and American scholarship on America, and also just to remember a dear friend and keep his project alive, a project that is very needful today on both foreign and domestic policy. I want to start off by gratefully acknowledging the generous support of the Neil and Jane Freeman Foundation, without which this conference and then the subsequent book, which will grow out of this conference, would not have been possible. Neil Freeman, a longtime patron of and supporter of and board member of the National Review Institute, has been involved in conservative politics for decades. Neil reminded me when I cooked this whole thing up that he was not only a longtime friend of Angelo's, but a neighbor of Angelo's, so a fitting supporter of this whole project. And I have to explain, too, that Bob Riley sends his regrets. He had a personal thing come up last week that he just couldn't avoid. We're going to include Bob's remarks in the eventual volume, but unfortunately he can't be here today. So in lieu of Bob's keynote, I wanted to expand my opening remarks a bit to start us off. At Angelo's memorial service back in the fall of 2021 in Plymouth, California, which is a beautiful spot in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, about an hour mostly north and a little east of Sacramento. A few folks gave some remarks, including Brian Kennedy, my longtime friend and colleague at Claremont, who's going to speak to us today, and also Thomas Codevilla, Angelo's youngest son. David Codevilla is sitting back there, so if you haven't met David, he's the tall, bald man with a Codevillian twinkle in his eye and a ready smile, so introduce yourself to him. David's great. But I wanted to recount Thomas's eulogy in full. It's not that long. We republished it at the American Mind, but I think a lot of people still haven't heard it, certainly haven't read it, and we're recording this, so I thought we should take the opportunity to record it for posterity. It's got a bunch of great information in it that a lot of you don't know, but will be delighted to learn, and it's quite charming. So after Thomas's remarks, I'll recount and embellish a couple of revealing events from the Reagan presidential transition and a little before and a little after, during which Angelo incurred the wrath of the CIA. And then I'll say just a few words about our two panels, and then I'll invite Steve, David, and Dan up here for our first panel. We'll take a little break after that and then come back for the second. Now, here's Thomas Codevilla, October of 2021, in Plymouth, California, actually at one of Angelo's neighbors' wineries, friends of Angelo's. We're here today because after years of gently suggesting that Dad get more rest, the good Lord took matters into his own hands. Dad was many things to many people. It is natural to ask at a memorial, who was he really? I will not speak on his intellectual legacy. People with actual doctorates are here to do that. That was an embellishment. Neither Brian nor I have a doctorate. But anyway, to the extent that it may help, though, here's how I understand him. Imagine, if you will, being born poor into World War II Italy with a predeceased father. You steal fruit from orchards to keep your belly full. Your scalp bears a hatchet scar from a fight with a preteen communist gang. You bathe in a cauldron. You are first in your class every year because you have to be. Standing at your father's grave, your mother lectures you on duty and family. After your unscrupulous Argentinian tango violinist relatives steal the money your mother set ahead, you only have enough money for the boat ride to America. You experience running hot water for the first time on that boat, and the gratitude never leaves you. Every August 8th for the rest of your life, you celebrate the anniversary of your disembarkment. You learn English from John Wayne movies and perfect your accent by repeating Winston cigarette ads. For those who weren't around for those, including me, it was Winston tastes good like a real cigarette should. You deliver newspapers to mobsters. You learn to knife fight to protect yourself at school. You build amateur rockets and gleefully shoot them over the Hudson River into New York. You meet your future wife by walking straight into a Valentine's Day mixer to which you were not invited, asking her, "Good evening, miss. Would you like to twist?" then taking her out for her first beer at age 18. Now, ask yourself, given that early life, what room is there in you for fear or self-doubt? When you have realized your wildest dreams through will and self-reliance, why stop dancing with the one that brought you? His mindset created some obstacles and demolished others. When Dad was in the Navy, one of his officer tests consisted of managing a simulated crisis on a ship. After 3 frenzied minutes of trying to complete every task himself, his commanding officer stopped him and told him that the point of the exercise was to delegate. Dad liked the story more than the moral. His informal motto was, make them stop you. If there was an offense or a federal injunction, or even if there was and he didn't think it was, quote, serious, he'd go ahead with what he thought was right and make the powers that be pipe up if they had any grief. On the flip side, I once found myself with him on horseback. The Codevillas have a lovely ranch in Wyoming, where one of the sons is, among other things, the most... as Angelo used to recount, he ran the town because he's the only tow truck operator and shop within 100 miles. This is them in Wyoming. I once found myself with him on horseback, stuck on the top of a hill at midnight, a freshly killed elk in our panniers, and wolves howling in the trees, scared out of my mind. I saw no way off the hill. Dad calmly dismounted, used a rock to demolish a fence panel, leaned back in the saddle, as one would in a lazy boy, as our horses picked their way down the hill. On one horseback trip deep in the backcountry, a kid in our group got the flu, and we started the 3-day ride out to the cabin. On top of a mountain pass in a sideways hailstorm, a cinch on the sick kid's horse came loose, and she toppled off, then commenced to get sick. I swear on my life, I saw Dad smile and hum some cheery little tune to himself as he calmed the horse and reattached the saddle. When a bear ate almost all of our food in the middle of another pack trip, that, to Dad, was a blessed opportunity to fish more for our dinner. Old news, but he suffered no fools. I bet his former students will hear his refrain, get serious, in their dreams. While I was in law school, I finally asked him to define his terms. What does get serious mean? Out came the old saw that those who are serious about the ends should be serious about the means. I replied that he was begging the question. He replied instantly that to be serious was to prepare and believe so thoroughly that one could stand in front of the whole world, maybe even God, and speak the truth with a capital T. How are you going to argue with a guy who imagines haranguing the Almighty every time he talks? He walked that walk. I've yet to hear anyone else going through 2 heart transplants with total continuity of attitude. My favorite story was when Dad apparently dressed down a 2-star general in a meeting, ruining any chance of the general supporting his pet project. Roy Godson, who's a longtime national security sort of scholar and functionary in the C3 world, among other things, advisor. Roy Dodson took Dad aside afterwards and asked in as many words what the hell he thought he was doing. The guy's a schmuck, Dad said. And Roy Dodson said, and who are you, the unschmucker? Everyone who knew him should be nodding right now. Dad unschmucked all day and twice on Sundays. He would frequently, and did, unschmuck for free. He put Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago in my hands at age 12, then asked me for a book report on it. He showed me a passage of Solzhenitsyn's that made him do, this is a wonderful description of Angelo in this state, if you had the pleasure of knowing him. He did that crazy-eyed, half-smile, half-snarl thing he only did when he was really fired up. This is the Solzhenitsyn quote. Violence has nothing to cover itself with but lies, and lies can only persist through violence. And it is not every day and not every shoulder that violence brings down its heavy hand. It demands of us only a submission to lies, a daily participation in deceit, and this suffices as our fealty. And therein we find, neglected by us, the simplest, the most accessible key to our liberation, a personal non-participation in lies. Even if all is covered by lies, even if all is under their rule, let us resist in the smallest way, let their rule hold not through me. That was the great Solzhenitsyn quote. Leaving aside parallels to current events, that is how I understood my dad. I still wish he had slowed down more to enjoy what he had built, but that was not Dad. So please, before you get back to your lives and your work, pause and consider how many walks of life this crowd represents, how one man could live enough lives to assemble all of you. If you want to honor him, I have 2 suggestions. First, drink this wine made from the grapes he grew, and share stories with someone from another life of his. The intelligence officer in him would appreciate a final, thorough debrief. Thank God for whatever experience brought you here today, then wake up tomorrow and work a little harder because Dad's got the day off. That was Thomas's eulogy. And I took to heart his advice. Oh, thanks. I took Thomas's advice. I did drink the wine, and I talked to one of his neighbors from one of his other lives that I didn't know as well. And the neighbor reported the unofficial motto of "Make them stop you" applied in practice. In his experience, they were walking through Angelo's property was filled with 5 or 6, or David can correct me if I'm wrong, 5, 6, 7, maybe 10, 15 acres of oak groves in addition to the vines and the vineyard. And they were walking along, and they had shotguns on their hip, and Angelo saw a goose fly overhead, and he just pointed in the sky and shot at it. And his neighbor said, "You can't do that." And he said, "It's my property, isn't it?" My other great Angelo anecdote, which always warms my heart, is my then-to-be fiance and I went up to visit him, and he needed help bottling a barrel of Zinfandel, which had been perfectly aged, and Angela, like my wife, hated overcooked, high-alcohol California wines. So it was a lovely aperitif-like Zinfandel by California standards, not too heavy. We bottled the whole barrel, which I forget how many cases that is. It's a lot. I put every cork in those bottles, but it was a good thing I did because he knew we were getting married. He couldn't make it. He had some obligation in San Diego long before agreed to, and so he was the dinner wine at my wedding. Gave us 7 cases for free. So. It was, that was the kind of guy Angelo was. Okay, now let me set up the incident in 1980 and then a follow-on interaction in 1983 and a wonderful little anecdote from the late 70s. Angelo was working for Senator Malcolm Wallop from Wyoming in 1983 on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, where he worked from 1977 to 1985. This experience is one of the many things that nurtured in Angelo a lifelong scholarly as well as practical skepticism of all claims and boasts of the U.S. intelligence community. He'd also just started working on the Reagan transition team on intelligence community stuff. So this confluence of events produced the following November 22nd, 1980 Washington Post article. I'll just read a couple parts of it. Transition tensions spill over at CIA and Senate committee. The tensions of transitions to Ronald Reagan are spilling over at CIA. The head of the president-elect's CIA team was lecturing his men just last week about the importance of sticking to policy questions and avoiding hit lists of officials to be ousted. Sounds familiar. When it turned out that 2 of the transition team were themselves being dismissed from their jobs in the wake of complaints from the CIA. One member of the transition team, sources say, reported that he and at least one of his colleagues had just been ordered fired from their full-time jobs on the staff of SSCI. The Republican staffers, Angelo Codevilla, an appointee of Senator Malcolm Wallop, and Mark Schneider, who owes his job to Senator Jake Garn, were reportedly flabbergasted at first word of their dismissals. Both were said to have informed their senators of their temporary duty, paving the way for a new regime at Langley. But no one, it seems, had told the prospective new chairman of the committee, Senator Barry Goldwater. According to several sources, one high-ranking CIA official, Legislative Counsel Fred Hitz, had expressed his chagrin to Goldwater's chief of staff on the intelligence committee, Earl Eisenhower. We at the CIA were concerned that the separation of powers doctrine had been done some violence to. When the names of the transition team were announced last Friday morning, we had some concern as a management body that several were employees of the legislative branch. As a result, Hitz said CIA officials were, quote, concerned that Codevilla and Schneider might be getting information as transition team members that CIA might not want to share with staffers for the Senate committee charged with overseeing the agency. However, Hitz added, and this is like typical bureaucraties, I did not make any suggestion that they be cashiered. Hitz did not cause them to be fired. We were just, as I say, concerned. That's the sum and substance of it. Goldwater said it wasn't the separation of powers business that bothered him. Rather, he said, this committee is so sensitive that we can't allow staff members to wander around town and sit behind desks without clearing it with committee leaders. I just wanted to make it perfectly clear that I'm not going to stand for it. And then the really telling piece is at the end, which is one well-placed Senate source suggested still another motive for the CIA complaints that touched everything off. at least some of these Republican staffers are pushing legislation that would break the agency up. They're not exactly persona grata to an agency that's about to be torn apart. In the next one, I'm going to read a letter from Bill Casey in a minute, but these Washingtonianisms that come through in this sort of thing are pretty revealing, and they're the sort of thing that Angelo would have scoffed at had he heard them. Like, we're expressing concern. My colleague Matt Peterson years back was researching a bunch of this and sent Angelo a note about it. It led to this delightful recounting from Angelo. Angelo was interested in the capital T truth, so I'm sure he won't mind me reading this short email he sent Matt. It's just too delicious not to share. And this is the sort of thing he would have freely offered anyway. So he was approached in the late 70s, soon after he joined the committee. Angelo was approached by John Bross, a man who had a history of service to the agency going all the way back to the OSS, an old CIA hand. And this is how Angelo recounted that interaction. So those of you that knew him, just, make his voice appear in your head while I'm reading. Oh yes, John Bross. Remember him well. He's the old boy who, once the agency had figured out I was not just another staffer, come to me and put his arm around me. Took me up to the director's office, Turner at the time, by a private elevator to which he had the key, showed me around in a manner that recalled the third temptation of Christ. All this can be yours. Then to finish the point, lunch at his estate overlooking the Potomac with Irish wolfhounds, wainscoting, etc. I did not bite. It would not be the last time that I got a come on. That was Angelo through and through. One last little piece in this delightful puzzle. Much as he admired and helped the Reagan administration, Brian Kennedy will talk a bit about his role in missile defense, among other things, later. Angelo harbored few illusions about how much it would take to change the culture at CIA. So in 1983, he participated in a Washington Quarterly Symposium on reforming the intelligence community. Angelo's essay was titled "The Substance and the Rules." The subhead and summary was as follows, and gives you a sense exactly what it was about. By focusing so exclusively on rules and standards of operations, the intelligence debate of the mid-1970s did not answer the fundamental question of what the United States expects of its intelligence services, or what they are to accomplish in order to meet the challenge of the 1980s. So this article occasioned the following letter from CIA Director Bill Casey to the chairman of the Select Committee on Intelligence, Barry Goldwater. Obviously, Angelo, after briefly getting fired, was hired back. Was still there in 83 and then served till 85. Again, note the Washingtonianisms in this letter, with all due respect to Chairman Casey, who was in many ways a great American. Dear Mr. Chairman, it is with considerable unhappiness that I raise to you the subject of committee staff member Angelo Codevilla's critical article that appeared in the summer issue of Washington Quarterly, juxtaposed as it was to your own constructive appraisal of the oversight process. Particularly distressing is the fact that Mr. Codevilla's distorted, or at least incomplete presentation, as reported, will lead most readers to conclude that they are the views and conclusions of the committee, when in fact, as we both know, many members and staff strongly disagree. That readers will attach great credibility and authoritativeness to his views is borne out by the fact that they were immediately reported in the press. Moreover, we can expect they will also find their way into the growing number of intelligence courses being given at colleges and universities. His indictment also will be read by our liaison services with unpredictable consequences. I'm especially appalled at the article's reliance on events and assessments that are now a number of years behind us, while at the same time failing to take account of changes and improvements that have been made in recent years and all the measures he addresses, in no small way thanks to the suggestions and support of the SSCI itself. While we have worked hard to foster the effective and responsible oversight begun by our respective predecessors and have achieved a relationship that clearly serves the American people well, irresponsible and non-authoritative indictment in the name of the committee can only undermine its good work and this agency's relationship with the committee. Out of respect for your many contributions and those of your colleagues, I can only deplore Mr. Codevilla's actions and the inevitably counterproductive effect it must have on our continued good relationship. You may wish to discuss this matter with Senator Wallop. I expect to do the same. So, Arthur has a wonderful anecdote that I just flagged for you ahead of time to pay attention to, confirming many, many years later the agency's sort of institutional view of Angelo, it survived from 1983 all the way up into the mid-2000s at least. So with that, I will end these opening remarks and